I rented a small, rustic cabin deep in the mountains, hoping for a peaceful getaway. The cabin was simple, with a single room that served as a kitchen, living room, and bedroom. It had a small fireplace and one large window that looked out into the dense forest. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no cell service, but that was exactly what I wanted. A break from the constant buzz of modern life. The first night was everything I had hoped for. After arriving in the late afternoon, I unpacked my things and settled in. I made a simple dinner, then sat by the fireplace, reading a book. The quiet was soothing, with only the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl breaking the silence. When it was time for bed, I felt more relaxed than I had in months. But the next night, things took a strange turn. After another day of hiking and exploring the surrounding woods, I returned to the cabin in the evening. I made dinner, sat by the fire again, and eventually went to bed. I was just drifting off to sleep when I heard a noise that made my heart skip a beat. A soft, shuffling sound, like someone or something was moving around outside the cabin. At first, I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just an animal. After all, I was in the middle of the forest, so it wasn't unusual to hear wildlife moving around. But the sound persisted, growing louder and more distinct. It wasn't just random rustling. It was the sound of footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. My pulse quickened as I lay there, listening intently. The footsteps seemed to move from one side of the cabin to the other, as if someone was walking around, checking out the place. I tried to stay calm, telling myself that it had to be an animal, but deep down, I knew it wasn't. The steps were too heavy, too measured to belong to any creature I could think of. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. I held my breath, waiting for something to happen, but there was only silence. After a few minutes, I cautiously got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I had brought with me. I slowly made my way to the window, feeling a sense of dread growing with each step. I shone the flashlight outside, sweeping the beam across the trees and the ground around the cabin. Nothing. No signs of movement. No eyes reflecting back at me. No one standing out there watching me. I let out a shaky breath, trying to convince myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. After all, being alone in a remote cabin could make anyone jumpy. But the unease lingered, making it hard to fall back asleep. I kept hearing faint noises, the creaking of the cabin settling, the wind rustling the leaves outside, and every sound set my nerves on edge. At some point, exhaustion finally took over, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and unsettled. I tried to brush off the events of the night before, chalking it up to my mind playing tricks on me. But as I stepped outside to get some fresh air, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The back door of the cabin, which I was sure I had locked the night before, was slightly ajar. I stood there, staring at the door, my mind racing. Had I forgotten to lock it? Was it possible that someone, or something, had been inside the cabin while I was sleeping? The thought sent a chill down my spine. I quickly checked the cabin, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the sense of being watched, of not being alone, was overwhelming. I packed up my things, cutting my trip short, and left the cabin that afternoon. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed, that whatever had been outside the cabin was still out there, watching me leave. I never returned to that cabin, and to this day, the memory of those footsteps and the open door haunts me. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The idea of escaping the noise and hustle of city life for a weekend alone in a remote cabin in the woods seemed like a dream come true. The cabin was isolated, nestled deep in a dense forest with nothing but tall trees and wildlife surrounding it. It was the perfect place to unwind, read a good book, and enjoy the serenity that only nature can offer. The first day was everything I had hoped it would be. I arrived in the late afternoon, with the sun casting long shadows through the trees. The cabin was small but cozy, with a single room that served as both the living space and the bedroom. A small fireplace stood against one wall, and there was a large window that offered a view of the forest outside. I spent the evening enjoying the warmth of the fire, the soft crackle of burning wood adding to the peaceful atmosphere. As the night drew in, the woods around me grew darker, the thick canopy of trees blocking out the moonlight. I could hear the sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the wind, and the occasional call of an owl. It was comforting in a way, a reminder that I was far from the chaos of the city. But then, as I was settling into bed, I heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. At first, I thought it might be a branch brushing against the glass. The wind had picked up, after all, and it wasn't unusual for branches to sway and knock against windows. I ignored it and continued reading my book, trying to focus on the words and not on the noise. The tapping continued, though, growing more persistent. It sounded almost rhythmic, like someone was deliberately knocking on the window. My heart began to race as I tried to convince myself it was nothing more than a branch or perhaps some animal curiously exploring the cabin. But something about the sound felt off, too deliberate, too human. Finally, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to check it out. I got up from the bed, my footsteps seeming unnaturally loud in the quiet cabin. The tapping stopped as I approached the window, and I hesitated before pulling back the curtain. For a moment, I saw nothing but the dark outline of trees against the night sky. Then I saw it, a faint imprint on the glass, like a handprint pressed against the fogged-up window. My heart skipped a beat, and I felt a chill run down my spine. The imprint was unmistakably human, but there was no one in sight. I scanned the area outside the window, but the dense darkness revealed nothing. The wind blew through the trees, causing the branches to sway and creak, but otherwise the night was still. I stepped back from the window, trying to shake off the growing sense of unease. It had to be my imagination, I told myself. Maybe it was a trick of the light, or perhaps the condensation on the glass had formed an unusual pattern. I tried to convince myself of these explanations, but the unease lingered. I returned to bed, but sleep did not come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside, set my nerves on edge. I kept glancing at the window, half expecting to see someone, or something, standing outside, watching me. The tapping didn't return that night, but the unease stayed with me until morning. The next day, I tried to put the incident out of my mind. I spent the morning hiking through the woods, enjoying the fresh air and the beauty of nature. But as I returned to the cabin, I couldn't help but notice something odd. The ground around the cabin was damp from the morning dew, but there were muddy footprints leading around the perimeter of the cabin, stopping at every window. The footprints were clearly human, and they hadn't been there when I arrived the previous day. A sense of dread washed over me. Someone had been outside the cabin, walking around and peering in through the windows. The thought of being watched, of not knowing who or what was out there, made my skin crawl. I packed up my things, cutting my trip short, and left the cabin that afternoon. I never looked back, but the memory of that night, the handprint on the window, the muddy footprints, haunts me to this day. It was a warm summer evening, and my friends and I were gathered in a small cabin deep in the woods. We were part of a summer camping program, and this was one of our favorite spots to unwind after a long day of activities. The cabin was old but cozy, with wooden walls that creaked when you walked, and a roof that groaned whenever the wind blew. We had spent many nights here, sharing stories, laughing, and just enjoying each other's company. That night, we were all sitting around, talking about everything and nothing, when the atmosphere suddenly changed. The lively chatter died down, replaced by an uneasy silence. I felt it too. Something in the air seemed off, like the woods around us were holding their breath. We sat there in that stillness, looking at each other, waiting for someone to break the silence. Then we heard it. At first, it was faint, just a soft rustling noise, like leaves being stirred by the wind. But as we listened, the sound grew louder, more distinct. It was the sound of heavy breathing, coming from right outside the cabin. It was slow and labored, like someone or something was struggling to catch their breath. We all froze, our eyes wide with fear. The breathing continued, growing closer and closer, until it seemed to be coming from right outside the door. And then we heard a voice. It was low and raspy, barely above a whisper. But we all heard it clearly. "Please, help me." The voice was desperate, pleading, but there was something about it that made my skin crawl. It sounded wrong, like it didn't belong to anyone human. We sat there, paralyzed by fear, unable to move or speak. The voice came again, this time louder, more insistent. "Please, help me." None of us dared to go near the door. We were too scared to even breathe. The only light in the cabin came from a small lantern in the corner, casting long shadows on the walls. I remember the way those shadows danced as we all sat there, huddled together, waiting for something, anything to happen. Finally, one of my friends, braver than the rest of us, stood up. She grabbed the lantern and slowly made her way to the door. We watched her, our hearts pounding in our chests. She reached the door and, with a trembling hand, pushed it open. The light from the lantern spilled out into the darkness, revealing the figure standing just outside the cabin. It was a man, barefoot, pale, and covered in dirt. He looked like he had been wandering through the woods for days. His clothes were torn, and his face was gaunt, his eyes hollow and vacant. He was standing there, just a few feet away from us, staring at us with those empty eyes. "Please help me," he said again, his voice cracking. We didn't know what to do. Should we help him? Should we run? The man didn't seem dangerous, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. Before we could decide, he turned and began to walk away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. We stood there, staring after him, too shocked to move. After he left, we spent the rest of the night on edge, jumping at every little noise. None of us could sleep. We kept the lantern burning until the first light of dawn broke through the trees. When we finally stepped outside, there was no sign of the man. It was as if he had never been there at all. But the memory of that night stayed with us. We never spoke of it again, but we all felt it. The unsettling feeling that something was out there in the woods watching us, waiting. That summer, we never went back to that cabin. Even now, years later, I can still hear that man's voice in my head, pleading for help, and I still wonder who or what he really was. My partner and I had been planning this backpacking trip for weeks. We both loved the outdoors and were eager to spend a few days exploring the rugged terrain far away from the hustle and bustle of daily life. We planned to camp under the stars and enjoy the beauty of nature. However, as we set out on our adventure, the weather began to change. The clear skies that greeted us in the morning were quickly replaced by dark clouds and the threat of rain. With the weather turning for the worse, we decided to find a more sheltered spot to set up camp for the night. As we hiked further into the forest, we stumbled upon an old, abandoned cabin. It looked like it had been there for years, maybe even decades, with its wooden walls weathered and covered in moss. The windows were broken, and the door hung slightly ajar on rusty hinges. Despite its dilapidated state, the cabin offered some protection from the approaching storm, so we decided to set up our small tent near it. By the time we got the tent up and our gear inside, the wind had picked up and the first raindrops began to fall. We huddled inside the tent, listening to the rain pattering against the canvas and the wind howling through the trees. It wasn't the most comfortable situation, but we were dry and safe, and that was all that mattered. As the night wore on, the storm intensified. Lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled through the mountains, shaking the ground beneath us. It was a bit unsettling, but we reassured ourselves that the worst of the storm would pass by morning. Sometime after midnight, I woke up needing to use the bathroom. I crawled out of the tent as quietly as possible, not wanting to wake my partner. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, and the air was cool and damp. I walked a few feet away from the tent and took care of business, trying to hurry so I could get back to the warmth of my sleeping bag. As I turned to head back to the tent, I froze. Standing about 30 feet away, at the edge of the tree line, was a man. He was tall, with broad shoulders, and was dressed in dark, tattered clothes. He was just standing there, completely still, staring directly at me. For a moment, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. Maybe it was just a shadow or a tree trunk that looked like a person in the dim light. But as I stared back, my heart pounding in my chest, I realized it was no trick. There really was a man standing there watching us. I called out to him, my voice shaking, "Hello? Who's there?" But he didn't respond. He didn't move. He just kept staring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. My heart was racing, and I could feel the panic rising in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to wake my partner, but I was afraid to take my eyes off the man, afraid that if I did, he would get closer or worse. After what felt like an eternity, the man finally moved. He didn't say a word. He simply turned and walked back into the woods, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for a moment, unable to believe what had just happened. My legs felt weak, and I was shaking all over. I quickly rushed back to the tent, woke my partner, and told them what I had seen. We didn't sleep much after that. The storm continued to rage outside, but our thoughts were consumed by the stranger in the woods. We packed up our gear as soon as dawn broke and left the area, cutting our trip short. As we hiked back to the trailhead, we couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every crack of a branch, sent chills down our spines. We never saw the man again, but the memory of his silent, unsettling presence has haunted us ever since. We often wonder who he was and what he was doing out there in the woods, watching us in the middle of the night.